one of my favorite interviewers, narrators said, Francis Crowe, who's about 90 now, maybe?
That's all this guy.
Yeah. Living in New England. She said, you know, we go to protests and we all feel really good because we say no. What we really need to do is just stay home and not shop, to withdraw from the system. We are soaked in violence in the United States. We live in the most militarized country in the world, and you in Virginia live in one of the most heavily militarized states. I was in Norfolk. Not that Chicago is guiltless. We have the headquarters of a whole lot of corporations. But I don't think there's a person in this room that doesn't see the connections between the military and the corporations and our empire building around the world. So I would be preaching to the choir if I went on and on about that. Instead, I want to talk about the people I interviewed, including Bill here. Guess whose that is?
That's yours.
I forgot to turn it off. Just ignore it.
Okay.
A former Catholic worker guest who is still very much with me in some ways. I want to talk today about people who do more than say no. They act no. Jim Wallace in 1984 gave the definition of resistance as acting no. All of us say no, sometimes loudly, sometimes vociferously. I hope always non-violently. But acting no is doing something active. And the people that I interviewed for this book and its companion book act their no by committing civil disobedience and often going to jail or prison as a result. They care so much. They are so appalled by the military-industrial prison complex that well, some people say it's a sacrifice, but I would dare to say that many of the people I interviewed don't call it a sacrifice, they call it a duty, an obligation, something they are really called to do. Often from a faith-based perspective, and David did what I think is just a very perceptive interview on his War as a Crime blog, a review of the book, where he addresses that, because many people in the peace movement are not faith-based. And I think there's some very real differences between what people do from a faith perspective and maybe what they're willing to give up and what other people do. I wanted to find out about that. And that's why I started this interview project. I wanted to find out what the
Voices.
what the Catholic worker was like. And so I wrote my first oral history. As I said at the end of the book, I interviewed over 200. Excuse me. Yes, it's my smartphone that yeah, poor little lady. Would you excuse me? Why don't we just put that over there? Because it'll take me too long to figure out how to turn it off. Anyway, I sort of roped myself into the Catholic worker movement by interviewing 200 people to find out what it was really like instead of just what people said about it. Then I started a couple Catholic workers in Saginaw, Michigan, left them in 2004 to be with my own grandchildren. I had been taking care of being with, walking with women and children. I decided I ought to walk with a few of the children that I was related to by blood. So I moved to Chicago. Shortly after I did that, I had more time to be involved in the peace movement. I found myself sitting in a church basement listening to people like Bill and others who had done a lot of time for resisting war, and wondering whether I could do that too. Well, without thinking it through other than just a night, I decided I could, and I risked a 6-month prison term, which I did not get. I got a scolding from the judge. He said I should know better at my age. A fine, which I didn't pay. I've never paid a fine. Many people don't, and usually they just give up. It's too much trouble to try to go after this stuff. But I got an itch to find out why people do this, and also, what is it like for middle-aged, middle-class, educated Americans to choose to go to jail? I knew it was different from the people who don't choose it. I knew it was a whole different experience. And the result is 2 books, Doing Time for Peace, and a companion volume. It's not volume 1 and 2, they're very different, called Crossing the Line. Crossing the Line just came out last week, and I accidentally sold my last copy. I only have 4, so I can't even show it to you. However, you can take one of these flyers, put the sale code PEACE in, easy to remember, at Stock, and get it for $30 with shipping, which is what I sell it for. So, you know, even though I don't have it to sell, I'll tell you just briefly what's in each book so you can decide. This book has a more striking cover, in a way. This was Father Lou Vitale of San Francisco when the picture was taken. 2003, build up to the Iraq War. Many of us were probably arrested trying to stop that war from starting, and we didn't do it. Father Lou's story, actually, is in this book, and it ends the book. He has a very much hope for the future. He could be talking about the Occupy movement. I interviewed it before Occupy, but he talks about the young people. He talks about their energy and their verve and their commitment and their drama. He admits that people our age, he calls it maybe like to be a little more reverent. Our actions are often maybe more orchestrated, more planned, probably less propensity for violence when you do plan those things. Because that's one thing I really like talking to 173 people, is you have to plan. You need to know what you're doing when you're getting into any kind of civil disobedience. But the first book that came out in October starts with one interview from the Second World War and one from the 50s, Brad Little, whom some of you might have known from, if you've been in the peace movement for a long time. Because I wanted to show that, as David said, people have been doing CD for peace for a long time. Not only the traditional peace churches, and an introduction puts all of that into historical context, but there were pacifists during the Second World War, and we talk about it in both books. And then, I tend to call it the glory days, because I came into the peace movement in 1967. Some of you might have come in about that time. And we could see the change. We could see the difference. We could feel the people behind us. So, each book has a Vietnam chapter. Crossing the Line has, I think, more Vietnam interviews, including a women's only action that I did not know about until I started this, called Women Against Daddy Warbucks. One reason we don't know about that is because they weren't prosecuted. They had a grand jury, they arrested a bunch of women, but they never took it to trial. You know why? They were looking for the men they were sure were behind it. The 70s were pretty sexist, and we were still sort of immune in sexism, particularly if you worked for the FBI. And they just weren't convinced that these women didn't have some mastermind. I think they thought it was John Grady, actually, but it wasn't. These women did it alone, and it's Women Against Anti-Warbucks, and that's in the second book. But another amazing action that I heard about, but didn't know much about, was the Camden 28. And they were acquitted. Does anybody remember the Camden 28? Yeah, let's hear a little bit about the Camden 28. I interviewed a fellow named Mike Giocondo. Mike worked for the RCP, writing for the newspaper for years and years, but he was always a nonviolent guy. He'd been a Franciscan in Guatemala, and that's where he got into the peace movement. I'm going to give this to Bill and look up Mike's story because it's pretty dramatic.
Hey David, who caught some slack in that court?
I think I can get it now. Mike was asked to join this group that was planning a clandestine draft file destruction act. They were going to shred draft files in Camden. He said, for several months we planned and practiced and cased the federal building. The draft board was on the top floor, kind of set in the roof with a parapet upon it, and they had to go up the fire escape to get into it. Here's a picture of two of the women going up the fire escape. Guess who took that picture? The FBI. Early on in the action, Mike invited his best friend, Bob Hardy, to join the action. I think they went to church together. Bob joined it, entered into all the action. The night happened. The FBI was already in the building when we went in, the station, in an unlit room on the floor below the draft board. They let us do everything we wanted, shred all these draft boards, put them into these big mail bags to carry out. And then when we were ready to leave, all of a sudden I hear, freeze, it's the FBI. Just like on the radio when he was a kid. At first I thought it was some kind of a joke, but there they were. I was tearing up records and they came up and grabbed me. FBI here? I just couldn't believe it. Anyway, they were put in jail, and all of a sudden they realized Bob Hardy wasn't with them. Where's Bob? His best friend had gone to the FBI early on in the action, and the FBI had actually supported the action, paid for the tools to break into the glass. They were out to get the peace movement, just like they're out to get Occupy today. They were out to get them, and they did, or so they thought. So, his best friend had retained them. There's more to that story too, but in the trial, Bob Hardy changed from being a prosecution witness to a defense witness, because when he had gone to the FBI with his misgivings, he didn't basically, and we need to talk about this afterwards, he didn't think it was nonviolent because they were destroying draft records, and he thought destroying property was violent. That's something I think we could talk about. They promised him that if he cooperated, nobody would get jail time. And of course, that wasn't true. They threw the book at him. They were like going for 27 years, the same thing that people are being charged with in property destruction actions now. So, he recanted and turned to the defense. And the Camden 28 jury found them not guilty. The only one that I know of during the Vietnam War. Lots of the Vietnam War destruction actions were not prosecuted because the trials would make such a big hoopla, and there'd be so much media that lots of times they weren't prosecuted because they just didn't want the publicity if they didn't have a really great case. One of the defense strategies was jury nullification. Any lawyers here? I'm not either.
Good.
Although I was married to the law, as I said, my one-time husband was a judge. Jury can nullify the law by refusing to convict in instances where the law would punish someone for doing the morally right thing. These people argued that they had done the morally right thing to destroy these death-dealing draft file records. And it hadn't been used very much. They used it during the abolition movement, actually, in the 19th century. But the defense also brought in entrapment, and that was very easy to prove because of what the FBI had done with this informer. Anyway, the jurors acquitted them in a very dramatic ending to the trial. Chief Justice Brennan once said it was the trial of the century. And there's been a wonderful movie about the Camden 28 and it had the reunion of people on the jury and people in the trial. And they had this reunion, and some of the women some of the people that worked for the draft board were there too. I asked Mike how it felt, about this, having his best friend become the informer. And it was hard for him. It was one of my hardest interviews. I mean, I had a lot of really kind of emotional interviews. But I brought up, by telling about this, he brought up stuff he hadn't thought about in a long time. And he said, we've talked at that reunion that was probably 5-6 years ago. He said, but it's like a cracked dish. You can mend it, but the crack is still there. And he got, kind of emotional. I'm still glad I interviewed him. I'm not like a reporter who pries. I think he needed to tell how hard it was for him to live with this. He said at one time he just wanted to die because he not only was betrayed, but he felt he'd betrayed all of the Camden 28. And, they were facing 27 years in jail. So, I didn't ask him, how could he know how he would have felt? But they were acquitted. So that is one of the dramatic stories that I have in the book, but there are many more. And they're not my stories. I feel I'm just a megaphone